to start with, it might be important to say something about why this focus on public sector innovation. It's not a new concept. It's a concept which has been around, at least if we look to literature, for 20 years or so. But it's becoming particularly relevant now, not only for research, but also very much in practice. And it's something that you find increasingly discussed in public organization strategies, but also you see the popping up of different initiatives. Both I'm thinking about Vinnova in the Swedish context, but also internationally. There is now this new observatory, or new, I don't know how much, depends how you frame it in time, but the quite recent development of the Economic Institute for Development, who has been creating this observatory for public innovation. And this focus is, I think it's very much, we can connect it to two developments. And one is external to the public sector, and is the so-called societal challenges that are increasingly emerging and putting pressure on the public sector. And with societal challenges, we can think about climate crisis, but also increasing aging of the population, which are a bit stressing out current structures, ways of working within the public sector, and calling for new ways of working. And particularly what is specific of this societal challenges is the kind of issue they represent. And to try to understand a bit their nature, it might be useful to bring in some theory from complexity science and define them, I mean, maybe as complex problems. And what does it mean that they are complex problems? It means that they are defined by several factors, which are not only coming in and influencing things for different sides, but also they are influencing each other. So when you start to act on one of these factors, the things, if you were talking about climate crisis, and for example, you are dealing with trying to lower levels of pollution in a city, right, and try to promote public transport. When you start to work on one factor, this will impact but also require the mobilization of other factors, and you cannot really foresee then what will happen. So if you think about what does it mean to promote public transport, it's both about making maybe public campaigns to inform people and try to change their behavior, but also means that you need to have more perhaps buses on the street, and this might lead to conflicts with car drivers and so forth and so on. And this means then that there is no given way to actually how can we tackle these societal challenges, these complex issues. And there is not just not given way, but also there is a political dimension. And with political, I mean, not in relation to parties, but really very much on views and way to see about and looking at these challenges. And there is no agreement about how to deal with them. And we can think about, again, climate crisis, where we have a very broad spectrum of positions, from groups who are lifting the importance of having radical changes in the way we live and organize our society, to other groups that are instead proposing technical solutions that might help us in tackling climate change without really needing to change our ways of living. And then we have even climate crisis negationists. And this is very much then what is happening, what is putting pressure from the outside in the public sector and asking for new ways of working and organizing. And this challenge is coupled with an internal challenge. Let me see now, because my slides are blocked. No, it's gone. And this internal challenge, I brought this image that actually it's from a team in Borås working with innovation. And this is the description of how some civil servants in the organization were experiences what does it mean to being a civil servant and try to tackle these kind of complex issues. And for those you who are not, who don't talk Swedish, the title says, "Is your organization messy?" And this is it's playing around with Messi, the football player, but also messy in the sense of chaotic. And as you can see, there is this play field where you have people with running around, a lot of balls being thrown, politicians moving goals. There is a fire down here that somebody's trying to extinguish. The managers are on the border of the field, being occupied with a consultant that is providing them the perfect theoretical strategy for how to win the match. And then we have the media sitting on a bench and observing all this quite upset. And this is of course a very funny image. I use it often in when I work with different public organizations, and usually people really recognize it and can laugh about it. But it's also, if we look then what theory is saying about public sector organizations, it's also very much about recognizing and depicting these sort of paradoxes that we can find within public sector innovations, which are related to the fact that these organizations are actually layering different logics which have been accumulated a long time, and moving from being original bureaucratic organization, mostly being concerned with doing things the right way and making sure that things are made accountable and transparent and so forth and so on, to moving instead towards the 1890s with the introduction of more private sector ways of working and ways of thinking around what the public sector should be and how it should be operated, that instead of being focusing more on efficiency. And now lately, because of societal challenges, but also the recognition perhaps of the limits of public sector's approaches within public organization, there is an idea instead that of working more, going back to a sort of idea of public value, but also recognizing the need of working across different domains within the public sector and in collaboration with external actors. And basically what scholars within public administration are saying us is that, and they are observing, is that these different logics is not that they substitute a long time. They are still there, often coexisting, and this creates a lot of tensions and paradoxes, which are also calling now for some sort of rethinking of the public sector and reorganization. And if this is telling us then why public sector innovation is becoming such a hype at the moment, and why there is so much interest around that, maybe it's also interesting to see then what is then framed as public sector innovation. And I saw there is someone here in the public from Helsingborg, and this is from a couple of years ago. And for those of you who don't know, Helsingborg is a municipality here in Skåne, which has been really taking on this idea of becoming and being an innovative organization. And I thought it was interesting just to bring up some examples of their work, and which is spanning around for the creation of new services towards citizens, to technical solutions in relation to, for example, how do you water parks, to new ways of working for civil servants, this office that is outside, but also very technical solution and almost products like this microwave that is dementia friendly. And this gives you, I think it's a very interesting, let's say, landscape, because it gives you the sense of how broad then public innovation can be, and how it's framed in practice. And this is also, it's not just about Helsingborg, but I'm thinking it's it's on a broader level. And here I'm bringing this definition of the Swedish Association for Municipalities and Regions, which has came up with this definition of what innovation is as something new, knitted, useful, and knitted, implemented. And again, as you can see, this can cover very many different things and make innovation this sort of very broad concept that can help us somehow, that it becomes very useful then when we think about what kind of changes are needed within the public sector, which is both internal about structures, how do we meet citizens, how do we collaborate with other actors. Then we have a concept that suddenly can help us in describing this overall movement or transition that needs to somehow, that we hope and we see the need for. But at the same time, I think it would be important to pay a little bit of attention, because innovation, despite this broad take there is on innovation within the public sector, innovation as a word, as a concept, as a specific history, and it comes from a very specific understanding. And in this sense, it has a particular way of framing both what is new, but also what is useful and maybe implemented as well. And as you probably know, the concept of innovation originally comes from the private sector, and it has been first introduced by Schumpeter with this idea of innovation as being a matter of creative destruction. And he used this concept as a way to describe how companies in a market, by innovating, can create a competitive advantage, and by coming up with an idea that somehow overcome current ways of thinking and solving specific problems, can create these competitive advantages that leads to improved profit. So in that sense, innovation is also very much connected to ideas of being very much connected to problem solving. It's about tackling problems, and also very much about being a sort of technical way of approaching them. And with technical, I don't mean necessarily about technology as such, but really about trying to solve a problem and try to being very interested in this question, and how do we solve problems. And another central concept within innovation is that of who is driving innovation, and this figure of the entrepreneur that has been for a long time an individual figure that nowadays perhaps it's a bit broader understood. It could be also of a group, but very much being characterized by these people that has a lot of energy, drive, grit, that doesn't give up when things don't work, that goes through often very messy processes where there is perhaps a lot of failures, but in the end they will somehow let's say achieve their result and succeed. And it's also, and this is very interesting, and these images is, this are just some images. If you type innovation in Google, is what Google will provide you. And I think it's really interesting, because then suddenly we start, they're hinting towards the fact that innovation is not such a broad concept as perhaps we are thinking about. And it's because of its history and where it comes from. And to this, there is another level to be added, and it's the fact, and this is very much about how innovation is perhaps something that is really, really strongly connected with our culture as Western society, which since the Enlightenment has been focusing very much on this idea of progress and improvement and ongoing improvement as central values within our society, both on a collective level, so how do we improve our society, but also on an individual one, and in that sense shaping very much our values, our ways of thinking. And in this sense, for example, seeing very much this idea of improving things, progress as something inherently positive. And in this kind of way of thinking, then innovation becomes per se the means for actually driving this process and ongoing improvement. And this is, it's becomes problematic in the sense that it's, as Sveiby which has been doing this really interesting book where they have this critical, try to have a critical look around the concept of innovation. It means also that we have a very low critical stances towards the concept of innovation. We think always innovation as something positive. And this is interesting because it's happening both in our everyday life, but also within research. There are very few studies who are looking at the negative consequences, for example, of innovation in a particular context or case. And in that sense, then it becomes interesting to see how this kind of ideas and framings that are not very wide, but are very specific, what do they do to innovation when it comes within the public sector? And as Nelinder has been pointing out, basically, when innovation comes into the public sector as being already going through it's a double translation. So innovation not only comes from, as I said, from the private sector, but from the market, but very much from product development. So the development of stuff like this one and products. And then you had the first translation moving from products to service in the private market, and then coming into the public sector. And as we see, this translation means that we are taking approaches, perhaps, and ideas that are very much formulated to produce stuff like this, that of course we can talk about. There is perhaps a level of complexity here as well, but of course it cannot compare with the kind of questions that the public sector is facing, like how do you ensure good health to all the population, or how do we make sure that we tackle climate crisis. And it's not only then that there is this gap in between the kind of problems innovation used to deal with and the kind of problems we are trying to use, we are bringing in innovation in. But there is also another aspect which is very interesting, is that within the market context, often there is no political dimension. I mean, there is one clear objective of why we are innovating. It's because we want to create more profit. While in the public sector, then, why we are innovating, we can have very different motivation. And in the sense, suddenly having this political dimension becoming much more relevant, but actually innovations, ways of thinking and approaches perhaps lacking the capacity to engage with this political dimension. And an additional, and all this, it's a bit even more messy if we consider then the relationship that there is between the public sector and the private sector in Sweden, but I would say in all Western society, where the public sector tends to have this inferiority complex towards the public sector. As Chiryanska described it in the 80s, and as the public sector feels they are the ugly sister, and look up to the private sector as some kind of model where things do actually work. And in my practice, I often meet this civil servants being very concerned and saying, oh, if we only could be more like a private company, or when I was working in a private company, things were much more, things worked much more smoothly, and we were more quicker, and so forth and so on. And this sort of complex of inferiority becomes very, very problematic also in the sense that then we tend to lack critical stances in bringing in this concept of innovation and in thinking, does it really fit the public sector? But it also means that we are, rather than perhaps thinking critically, that we are confirming certain myths. For example, the myth that bureaucracy cannot innovate. And about this, I really suggest you the PhD thesis from Alexander Stire that in 2007 did a number of studies on bureaucratic organizations within the private sector, which were really good at innovating, and that's somehow debunking this idea that bureaucracy cannot innovate. So in that sense, we can describe this concept of public sector innovation as a very ambiguous concept, both in theory and in practice. The image that I have here comes from Innovationsrådet's report from 2013, where they talk a lot about how innovation in the public sector is about shifting the balance, and somehow they point at different sort of tensions that need to be dealt with when we are trying to work with innovation. And these tensions are about the need for actual delivering solutions to citizens on an everyday basis, but at the same time having space for experimenting and learning. A certain strong focus on efficiency, or in some cases perhaps efficacy, and rather the need of having redundancy, of having space of resources for actually driving experimentation and learning. But also the need of recognizing the importance of individuals and trying to develop solutions that fit the diversity of individuals, but at the same time thinking about and the need of having collective answers as well. And also distinction between trying to solve a problem, but also dealing with its political dimension. And what is design doing here? I guess if you're here today, you might know quite a lot about the role of design in the public sector. And now there has been this engagement of perhaps design as one of the possible approaches to drive innovation, and having this broad focus from development of new services, but also engaging with policies. But these kind of experiences are, and this we can see it very much within design research, there is a growing recognition and attention towards these aspects of complexity, paradoxes, and somehow perhaps clashes between traditional ideas of innovation and what does it mean when you start to bring them in the public sector. And what has been lifted is this, the importance of how do we then create reflective and learning processes, often together with public organizations, to try to understand a little bit better what kind of innovation is needed here, and how we can actually achieve the sort of change we are looking for. And in my work together with other colleagues, we go back to this idea to describe this sort of, what do we mean with this idea of reflection and learning? We go back to Sean's understanding and definition of design as a matter of not only solving problems, but very much a matter also of setting problems or framing problems, or defining actually not only developing solutions, but also working with this question of what exactly is the problem here that we are trying to tackle. And seeing very much these processes then together with public organizations as a matter of fostering collective problem solving and problem setting, and try to create capacity and processes that can help public sector innovation and thinking about what is the actual problem here, how it came into be, and what should be done and could be done perhaps in relation to it. And of course, these things are most probably a bit theoretical, but I just want to bring you a case, or no, rather a story about the translation of innovation in the public sector. And I call it a story and not a case, because as you will see, I didn't find yet a good way of framing it, but it's also a story because there is, it's not just what happened that is important, it's also what didn't happen. And as I will lift when talking, there are a lot of moments of silence and interruptions, which became particularly important, the moments where we didn't know what exactly we should do and could do. And this story is about the establishment of a digitalization lab that perhaps many of you have familiarity with. And there will be a lot to be said about also this concept of the lab, but maybe I decided to don't overdo things. Maybe we can have we can keep a discussion about labs for the discussion after the presentation, because it's also a concept that is coming very much from the private sector, traditional ways of thinking of innovation, and coming in the public sector and not really always working as one would expect or would hope for. And the organization I've been working with whom I have a very long, I've been collaborating with them since 2014, doing several projects together. And so I have a long history of working with them, and they are managing drinking water, stormwater and sewage as well as waste in the south of Sweden. And they are a Kommunförbund, so a public organization that is a collaboration across different municipalities. And why they got increasingly interested in this concept of innovation is very much related to the kind of changes that are happening within waste and water management, both in relation to policy, but also very much because of climate change. And we can see that both waste, for example, is moving, and this is mainly pushed by policy, by this idea that we should treat waste in the most efficient way. So it's about, making sure that people recycle things, but also making sure that flows of material get reworked in the proper way, so that we get new materials, or that the part that cannot be recycled is used somehow, for example, incinerated to create heat. So very much this idea of waste as something technical that needs to be dealt, to rather becoming more and more a socio-technical and political issue. And very much this is policy around waste is asking municipalities to push citizens in actually reducing the amount of waste that is produced. And doing that means to support, for example, second-hand shopping, but also repairing instead of buying new things, and so forth and so on. And it's a huge shift, because it's very much about working with behavioral change, but also how do you create an ecosystem around second-hand consumption and repairing that works for the citizens, and so forth and so on. And similar questions are happening in relation to water, that, for example, in the south of Sweden is going from being an abundant resource to a scarce resource because of climate change. But also there is an unpredictability of stormwater. It's becoming an increasing challenge how to manage it. And this is in both senses, there is in both dimensions of water, both as a resource, but also something that needs to be managed. Then it's increasingly highlighting the need to change behaviors, to look for collaborations across sectors, and so forth and so on. And very much recognizing this and recognizing the key role of themselves as an organization that should actually drive and inspire towards sustainability. They formulated a new strategy in 2018, and among other things, they name the need of establishing innovation lab. And the digitalization lab was the first initiative of the Minno Innovation Lab. And it had the goal of support digitalization within the organization, but also the development of an innovation culture. And the idea was to work with an internal call that was based on the idea of inviting all employees that had ideas about digitalization to apply. It was what was given was financing for equipment and external consultants that could help out in driving 6 to 9 months projects to test things, to test possible digital solutions. And ideas were selected not by managers, but by a pool of internal experts that were both experts within digitalization, but also there was people from HR, so human resources function, and in this sense, and the communication office. And in this sense, there was this attempt of trying to look for projects that could have actually this impact, not only on the technical aspect of digitalization, but also actually on this quest of changing and supporting culture. And this was an initiative that was internally financed across all the departments. And they were really proud of, because one was this idea of creating some kind of shared effort across departments, which was perhaps something that actually they've been struggling with beforehand. And I was involved in the project together with a colleague from organizational studies. And I guess, as many of you may know, you start with a plan for a project and then things just, just life and reality kicks in. So we had this focus initially that we would be part of the process, being within the organization and help out the development of the lab with a clear focus on learning. And with learning, we meant both supporting people driving different efforts in thinking about what they were doing, how it could be later on implemented, who they should actually talk and involve in the process to make sure that not just testing things, but also thinking about their aftermath, but also helping out the organization in reflecting on the overall role of the lab. And this plan got quite slightly or dramatically changed, depends how you put the perspective, because of course the people with whom we wrote the project quit. So we got new people on board, and particularly a brand new person was employed to actually drive the lab. COVID also kicked in, which meant we couldn't be within the organization. So all this process I'm presenting now has been done through Teams, through Microsoft Teams, and not just in the interaction between us and the people from the organization, but also all the, sending in the project selections and so forth, and so on. And our role then shift from being this sort of perhaps active part of the lab in becoming a more working as evaluators in a more perhaps traditional terms of and to evaluate both the process of the lab, but also trying to map the current innovation culture within the organization. And what we thought to do was to start by doing something perhaps that is very much design inspired, and try to understand what is the need in this organization, what kind of needs of and about change can we see. And we did that by starting interviewing, and we interview both top managements, but also we focus very much on the people who applied to the lab for funding. And we try to understand then the reality of different units and what was happening there. And here I was just highlighting some of the things that emerged from this very interesting dialogues. And one thing that was very crucial is the fact that the infrastructure of waste and water is a very demanding infrastructure in terms of, for example, maintenance, but it's also a very sensitive infrastructure in the sense that nothing, especially around water, nothing can go wrong because of what the possible health and social consequences that will have. Let's think about it. You know, you maybe have experienced yourself when there are some disruptions within the water system, what kind of hell that's create when water is maybe not drinkable anymore. And in that sense, it made very clear that failure was something very, very difficult to actually bring in as an idea and a value within that particular context. And something that also was emerged that quite clear, it was the need of creating more coordination and collaboration across the different units. And this was expressed both on the top management level as well as from operational units, which were understanding the need of collaborating more, but still very much struggling with understanding then how this could be done. And within this theme of coordination and collaboration, it became clear that the organization had already some units actually being in charge of working with development and innovation somehow. But both of these units, as well operational units, were recognizing that there was a gap between them. And both of them were naming how there were projects carried out, but often to try to test new things, create new solutions, but then the difficulties of bringing back these results within operations. And then there was this idea, of course, that and perhaps this was a bit less strong, but very much this idea we should have develop more agile ways of working. We should test and fail fast. The importance of mobilizing all single employees, changing the way of thinking, making them a bit more bold and ready to take risks and so forth and so on. And what struck me and my colleague when we looked at this material is how somehow it standed in contrast with what was the main focus of the digitalization lab, where a lot of push was instead put on this agile ways of working, testing and failing fast, mobilizing single employees. And we found themselves a bit on this dilemma. What is going on here? And is this discrepancy that we are seeing, is it something that is just, to what extent does this is something that is actually specific? Because of course we didn't talk with all the organization, we just talked with perhaps 10 units, some managers. So we wanted to understand, we saw this discrepancy, but we weren't sure how much is this something that is actually true to some extent. And we started to think also then, what is the role of the lab here? Is it actually contributing to some kind of change, or rather because it's not focusing on this question of collaboration and coordination, perhaps reproducing the status quo, and also with this focus, on units rather than thinking about collaborative processes. What is going on here? And we didn't really have a clear answer. So what we thought to do was to try to bring up these questions to both the project manager and the board overseeing the lab. So what we did is that we tried to organize all these findings or these preliminary findings we found through these interviews, and try to highlight what we saw was discrepancies between these needs we found and the vision for the lab, and try to set up some kind of reflective process. And the reaction we got, it was not what we expect. We got a lot of silences, but also very negative reaction to the material we presented. And among other things, we were asked if we were accusing via seed or something, or criticizing them, or so forth and so on. And we got very puzzled because we thought, but we are trying to understand. We try to came with questions, and because we don't know if what we see is actually what you also see. And so this was the first moment of really, feeling not very, that the process got really interrupted somehow. But of course, we wanted to really understand what is going on here. What is that actually created such a strong reaction to the things we presented? So we tried to continue the conversation, particularly with both with the project manager, that, as I mentioned, she was new within the organization, but also the person sitting on the lab board was been working for the longest time with questions of innovation and development within the organization. And through this conversation, it came up, they asked us to create a framework about public sector innovation. And this became quite a turning point. So in this framework, we try to lift a general understanding of why the differences between public sector and other sectors, and how that then perhaps means that when you think about innovation, you need to think a little bit differently as you would do within the private sector. And this was really interesting, because it became really, this framework became a turning point, because suddenly we could start to talk again. And what it emerged is actually these questions of collaboration, of coordination, and needs that we find were very loaded and very central questions for all organizations, which were discussed at several levels, being very much attempt to be solved on also on a strategic level. So there was a lot of attention to them, and they were very also, as I mentioned, loaded, because perhaps there was still not a full understanding of how do we understand we need to do that, but then how do we go about them? So towards the end of the project, we put together this framework, but also we came up with some suggestions on how the lab could support and start working in more collaborative ways across the different units. And we met with the project managers and some representatives from the board few months after the end of the project. And what we discovered is that they were using the framework, but not so much, but they were also planning to basically do another round of the digitalization lab exactly in the same format. So not picking up on these suggestions or ideas of how to work in a collaborative and try to support more, for example, projects across units rather than single units. And again, me and my colleague were very, very puzzled by this. And again, as I think this overall process as being a question of what is going on here, and what is that we are seeing, and what are, and as I mentioned, there was also a lot of silences and somehow interruptions, which also left us a bit always very puzzled in trying to understand what was happening on the other side, and how we should somehow react or try to deal with that. And what we did afterwards is trying to, of course, we sensed there was something about mandate and legitimacy going on, and we could sense it across the people we talked with, especially when they were meeting us in groups, but also how the lab was initially thought, and so forth. So we did instead, we sit together and try to gather and lift all the data that we could find, that we were talking about this question of mandate and legitimacy. And it became evident that the digitalization lab has these strong pressures, both coming from ideas about digitalization and what digitalization is about, how it should be driven. And in its sense, also very much this idea, agile ways of working, focusing on solution, testing and failing, very much being part of this discourse about what is digitalization about. But at the same time, also we could notice how these ideas were very much embraced by the top management. And in this sense, creating this, not only this strong external pressure, but also an internal one with top management saying, this is how we should understand innovation. And at the same time, the lab coming in and having a project management that was not only new to the organization, but also working on a temporal position, a 1-year contract, putting the lab in a very difficult place for actually being able to challenge perhaps this understanding. And as you can imagine, this, as I said, this is a story. It's not a case. And as I said, was really complex case. And still there are so many things we don't know. There are so many silences and things you cannot really go back and ask somehow. But still, I think there are, or at least there are some key takeaways that I think we can, that can be raised. And I think it's very much, I think it's a case that really lifts this complexity and paradoxes of public sector internal organization and governances, and where you see that these new ideas coming in are, to what extent they are actually somehow creating tensions with the existing reality. It also very much restates that the possibility for social learning and change are shaped by the dynamics of formal and informal power structure that characterize every social context. And this, I think, it's really, really important in the sense that we cannot think to deal with innovation in the public sector or in any social context, organization, community, society, without thinking about the relationships within people, who is having a privileged position, who is having a less privileged position, and how ideas and ways and possibilities for change are actually shaped by this. It also, I think, exemplifies very well about ideas and frames about what innovation is, can be detrimental to rather than supporting transformation in the public sector. And also it shows the risk of having attempts at innovation that more or less intentionally end up as a matter of change washing. And in this sense, becoming this sort of movement or attempt of create this sort of attempt to change that is actually happening only on the surface and not really actually engaging with more structural and fundamental questions within a social setting and an organization. And this quote it's from a book from the 18th century that describes the unification of Italy, and now the south of Italy that was still very much in a feudal kind of society, actually how the noble people there actually use this bigger change of becoming part of Italy as a matter of actually restating their power position and not really changing relationships and rediscussing power within that context, which has been led by for example, to the fact that we have mafia today in the south of Italy. But this is perhaps it's another story. So as you can see, this is very, very complex. And then I'm a designer myself, so it's really okay. Then what does it mean this for design? How do we deal with that or try to engage with this deal? Maybe it's a big word, but I'm thinking, and it's mainly two things, and this is the last two things I have to say for today. And I was going back to this definition of design as formulated by Pelehen, who describes that basically when you design something, as a designer, you are playing around with tradition. So what is there, what people understand as their reality, and transcendence, that is this attempt of moving beyond this idea of creative destruction somehow. And Pelin says very clearly that as a designer, you need to be able to balance these two dimensions. You cannot go too much into being too much destructive, because otherwise the context will just react negative to what you are proposing. But of course, you cannot just stay in tradition. And I think it's interesting to see then how this definition has been picked up within design, because it's very much, yes, we need to balance transition and transcendent, but of course we need to transcend, and taking for given that we need perhaps always to look at ways to disrupt context, to bring about some major transformations and so forth, and so on. And what I'm thinking at the moment is that perhaps to what extent do we actually understand what is there, and should we perhaps focus a little bit more to see tradition, current ways of working, current systems, current power structures, not as something that we should just repass and try to rework, but engage with and try to understand how do we ended up here? How is it an organization works like it works at the moment? What kind of attempts of change have been done before? What were the aims and what they actually resulted in? And in that sense, trying to think a little bit about this idea, not of just making things, but really like unmaking, and try to reconstruct processes, previous processes and attempts for change and what they resulted in, and try to make that visible and work together with civil servants to make that a bit more, to give them also the possibility to have this understanding of their own context, but also lifting the question of not only what is that we need to change, but also what is that we need to maintain when we are trying to work towards change. And as I mentioned, within this process also, there was a lot of these silences, interruptions, and as an expressions perhaps of some kind of dynamics that were going on among people, in between people, and both related to specific ideas and perhaps way of seeing what innovation is and what kind of change is needed within the organization. And now perhaps we a bit challenged slightly, but also very much on this level of relationships and power across them. And in that sense, I think it becomes very much important to develop, how do we develop an ethically grounded design practice? Because of course we can navigate power. I mean, if you can, and this is, I mean, Machiavelli has been very much writing a lot about this already in the 16th century, that we can understand the situation, understand how is the formal, informal power structure, who is the leader here, align with them, and so forth and so on. So in that sense, there is a possibility of understanding to a certain extent power dynamic and interact with them. But the issue is then what is the ethical way and to then engage with that, and should we always try to align with power and with the consequences of that means? And I think in this sense, this kind of questions, and I think it was Fliberg in almost 20 years ago was discussing about this in relation to planners and city planning activities. And it was lifting this need of developing another kinds of knowledge for planners that is not about theory and it's not about technique, but rather is some sort of ethical knowing of being in practice and understanding what is the right thing to do here. And I think this resonates very much, or at least in the experience I had with what perhaps design engaging the public sector should also develop. But I leave it here, and I hope we can have now a good possible conversation around this. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Anna. It was a very interesting presentation, I think, and I please everybody to write your questions, reflections, whatever in the chat, and we'll pick it up from there. I can see that Jonas has one reflection. I also have one reflection, but let's start with Jonas' reflection first, and then we can wait for you to have the time to think and reflect and write your own questions in the chat, and we'll have a discussion. And if you don't want to write it and just say it, please raise your hand in that case. But can we start with Jonas' reflection here, and that is what is needed to be understood about design thinking in an organization and public sector organization in order to make design projects less provocative. Did you prepare them? And I think you mean, Jonas, the participants in some way?
I think it's, thank you, Jonas. I think it's a really good question, but I want to be a little bit provocative, and then I turn it around. What is the designers need to understand about an organization to bring in design? And how do you understand if design is always the right approach? I think this is two questions. The questions you are raising and the question I'm raising are really much, there is some sort of dynamic connected there. I've been doing other efforts. In this one, it became the question of what design is and how it should be understood. It became a little bit eaten up by this somehow, by these ideas of digitalization. So somehow we did an effort to try to bring in design, but then it became really somehow trapped in these logics of instead agile ways of working, Scrum, failing fast, and so forth and so on. So this is a very particular one situation. So maybe it's an advice that if you work with design with digitalization, maybe it's good to make really clear what are the differences. Don't try to, as we did, perhaps in the wrong way, to go with the flow. Oh, you know, digitalization is a good train, perhaps it's not. But I think it's also about understanding, is design always the best approach, and what do we need to think, or how do we need to change design so it fits better the public sector? So for example, when I work with civil servants, I'm increasingly using the idea of reflective practice, because then I'm thinking about, then maybe it's more about how do you create capacity among people within the public sector to have this sort of space, time, and possibility to think critically about what they do, the reality they meet, and so forth and so on, and not so much perhaps about them. And of course, they can use, design becomes a possible tools to do that, but I rather put the emphasis on this idea of reflective practice, also because it's something that they can perhaps relate easier and see more the value. It talks more about who they are as professionals. I don't know if this was a good answer.
Yeah, that's a perfect answer. Thank you, Anna.
Okay, we have some more questions or reflections in the chat, and maybe I'd pick up Gerald's reflection first. I think that is something to do with mine as well, but we'll pick it. And to just summarize it, Geoff writes that I think a challenge in the different time frames between big institutions and short-time intervention. Just to get into the planning cycle can be a longer project than the intervention's lifespan. Do you want to reflect on that, Anna? That's different time.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is very interesting because, as I mentioned, I worked with this organization for 8 years. And but I worked first within a department, and there we worked like for approximately 6 years, and we reached this level of actually creating changes in structures and ways of working. So it was really also puzzling suddenly to move on this, you know, coming from with this, and perhaps it's also something to learn about, that we were a bit. We came with this legacy of thinking, yes, we know about this organization, we have trust from them, we understand them somehow, and actually realizes that we did not, because it was new people, it was on a different level, and so forth and so on. So I think absolutely there is something about short-time intervention and longer frames, but it's also through the longer frames, how do you make sure that you don't take things for granted? And this is, I guess, it's something really I need to, it's not just because I've been working with them with 8 years that I can take for granted that I know them. I guess this is, but for sure there is also this issue with this short, and I guess it goes perhaps with this idea of change washing I was talking about, thinking, I mean, there are so many deep-rooted problems, or problems, maybe it's not the right word to use here, but issues and tensions, and thinking that because you set up something that is just working on a short time frame, that you can actually dig into them. It's very perhaps a bit too optimistic.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. We have some clarification question from Laila, and I'm not really sure what Laila is referring to, but maybe Laila, will you please ask your questions directly to Anna, maybe?
Thank you so much. I just thought it was really interesting as a reflection on what you said before about the previous question that you answered. So that, do you mean that the focus should be on the result rather than the process and the language that we use in design? So we don't talk about design, but we just think about what do we want to achieve with it?
That's a good one. I think it's a lot about the context, perhaps. So that you understand that is not, the design is a particular way of working. And maybe understand that it's not given that it's a solution for everything, right? Because then we end up in this. I'm really concerned at the moment that, you know, design is a hammer, and then when we see everything it's like nails. So this is my really big preoccupation at the moment. So it's a bit about maybe staying with this problem setting phase within design, and try really what is the context here? What is the actual issue? And is it always design in traditional ways, prototyping, you know, having this sort of, because as designers, we also come in with very specific ideas of how to drive processes. You start with the need, you come up with a set of possible proposals, and you test some of them. And then by testing, then you understand which one is the good one. But this is not always possible, as I see in my practice, but also I'm starting to thinking, is always the right way to go? Or do we need perhaps instead in certain contexts to start a lot staying with this phase of problem setting, opening up problems, understanding things, and also understanding then, is it design we should talk about? Is that reflective practice? What other ways we could approach things? Because one problem also that I see with coming into with design is that it becomes really about designers. And then what does it mean? I mean, in the public sector, I mean, some organizations now are hiring designer, but most of the people is not designers. And what are you creating then in that relationship? You're basically saying them, you don't have the capacity to do this because you are not a designer. And then they run and take these courses into design, while maybe it would be more interesting to see what kind of resources they have within their own practice to actually work with change processes. And I think this is very much, and I think this goes back also to Donald Schoen's work about reflective practitioners, and showing that actually within all professional practices, there is this sense of both ethics, but also this sense of understanding, engaging with problems, understanding what the problem is, and try to tackle it. So in that sense, perhaps it can be more giving. I don't know.
Perfect, thank you. We have a lot of things going on in the chat right now, and we have one reflection about from Kalle that is Gustav is also thinking about. But we just have a few minutes left here, and I like to highlight first, if you don't mind, Kalle, here, Tash question or reflection, and that is, but since design is much about root cause, you really need agency and mandate, especially now when change many times is paradigm shifting and not just incremental improvements. Hence, it quickly becomes all about people. And I really would love to hear you, Anna, reflect on that one, because that is quite interesting.
Yes, I really agree. And then because it becomes about people, it becomes about relationships, and then it becomes about I mean, you never enter in a blank space. You always enter in spaces that have histories, and it doesn't matter if it's an organization, if it's a city, there is a story here. There are certain relationships, there are certain conflicts. And then I think it becomes about this sensibility, then how do you position yourself into this? And sometimes also perhaps I'm thinking as a designer, when do you decide to not be part of things? Maybe it's also a question we should raise ourselves. When do you retain from acting because you are because you see that will not be in line with what was planned from the beginning about ideas of change and so forth and so on. And in that sense, I think something that I didn't mention, but I can just flip it in. I think it's really interesting because I don't know how it's in Sweden, but in Italy, I remember when studying design, we had this discussion about other design profession, architects, engineers, having some kind of professional liability. So if you do something and something goes wrong, people hurt themselves, you are liable, but not designers. And in that sense, I'm thinking becomes when we come into the public sector and we start to deal with issues that are political, very much because it's about views of the world, right? What kind of welfare do we want to see in the future? Then, I mean, you cannot come in and think that you are a neutral actor. I mean, you need to take a stance. And you do it anyhow. I mean, even if you don't want to do it, because you become part of these existing relationships and people and so forth and so on. And then how do you just go with the flow and then it becomes what it becomes, or do you actually actively recognize there is stances going on here, and where do I position myself?
Perfect. I think it's a good question, and maybe we should leave it in that hanging space there, because the time is running out. It's almost 9:45. And thank you very much, Anna, for this great presentation, and thank you, Anna, and everybody else for this great talk afterwards, these reflections together. I think it was a really great presentation and very, very interesting. I think in the chat that people are really enjoying this this morning Experio Seminars.